Everything nice and aligned. Let's go ahead and condense our two commentaries to make it a little bit easier to see. Everything nice and aligned. And that's the echo. There we go. That's better. All right, we'll give that just a minute. Let everyone else log in. Let's make sure. There we go. Yes. Hope everyone has been having a nice day or longer since the last time we met. And as usual, I'm still hoping my internet holds out. Unfortunately, the installation from last week was not able to go forward, so we're still waiting on a reschedule for that. Yes, the reliance we have on technology. But it's been a little bit more steady, so here's hoping that it's going to hold out for us. Just a reminder that if it does drop, assume that the stream is gone, because it can take quite some time to get it back. So move on with your own study in life, and don't wait for me. Leave me behind. My internet will only slow you down. All right, well, with enough time now to get people logged in, let's go ahead and jump into our reading. So we are picking up here in chapter 27 of the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, and we are in Parashat Tetzaveh, which begins at the very end of chapter 27 in verse 20. And we have been looking in Parashat Truma with the construction of the Mishkan and all of its implements. And in Parashat Tetzaveh, we are going to continue that discussion. We're going to start off a little bit with oil, and then in chapter 28, we're going to jump into the clothing of the Kohanim, of the priests. So as has become our style for the last few weeks, we are going to be looking at both Rashbam, here found on the left, as well as Rashi, here found on the right, as a general commentary, providing both traditional insights as well as a pshat understanding of the text, meaning a straightforward interpretation in its location, although, as we'll see, they disagree a little bit. I'm not going to get quite as much argumentation in this particular Torah portion, and we'll talk about that as we go through and note the similarities rather than the disagreements. But as always, we need to start off with the Torah. So let's get these last two verses of chapter 27 out of the way. You shall further instruct the Israelites to bring you clear oil of beaten olives for lighting, for kindling lamps regularly. Aaron and his sons shall set them up in the tent of meeting, outside the curtain which is over the ark of the pact, to burn from evening to morning before the Lord. It shall be a dew from the Israelites for all time, throughout the ages. All right, so here we are getting the specific instructions that there needs to be a donation, a collection of the oil that will be used for the lighting of the menorah that is found in the Mishkan and then later in the tent. So the menorah, as you probably all know, is the oldest and most famous symbol of Judaism. And of course, its being lit is very, very important. We're going to look at our commentary here to see how to understand some of these things. And well, let's go ahead and take a look at Rashi to start here. So he is focusing on this phrase clear, this zach, if you will, that is an adjective which needs additional elucidation. Is there essentially an unclear oil? Well, what he is saying is that yes, this is without lees, without the debris and the leftovers that come in the usual squeezing process. And this was affected not by straining the oil, but as we learn in Masechet Menachot in the Talmud, he lets it ripen on the top of the olive tree, etc. Meaning that if you go to Menachot 86a, you can look into a longer discussion. However, Thankfully for us, Rashi has brought part of that for us, the part that seems relevant to this particular passage, which is talking about the fact that this is zach katit, that this is clear but beaten oil. And this katit is the operative phrase. He pounds the olives in a mortar and must not grind them in a mill, so that there may be no leaves. And after he has thus extracted the first drop of oil, he may bring them into the mill and grind them. The second oil, that obtained by grinding, is unfitted for use in the candelabrum in the menorah, but is permissible for meal offerings, which had to be mingled with oil, since it is said here, beaten for the light, and hence it is not essential that it should be beaten for the meal offerings. So Rashi is trying to explain that the beaten here is an operative part of how the clearness is created. Now, beaten may not be exactly the best modern English word. In English, we would probably use pressed. And indeed, this is very akin to the current practice, and the one that's been going on for a few thousand years, of pressed olive oil, and the distinction between a virgin olive oil and the non-virgin olive oil. That is to say, the virgin olive oil is usually referring to, if my culinary teaching was right, the first press of that oil, the initial pushing on the olive, releasing the oil with that initial pressure that does not cause the entire olive to be ground down into a mush, but is merely that first collapsing of it and causing some of the oil to be released. Obviously not all of the oil, but the advantage, of course, is that this is the loosest oil. This is the easiest oil to extract, and as such, it will be the clearest oil, the cleanest oil. As Rashi points out, given that we are told to use this olive oil that is zach katit, this clear beaten oil or clear pressed oil, here for the lighting of the menorah, the lack of those terms that comes with regards to the use of olive oil for the other offerings indicates that that is a special requirement for this mitzvah, but it is not required for the preparation of other sacrifices using olive oil. So therefore, the other olive oil can be made in the more, what's the right word, destructive process, the more grinding, milling of the meat of the olive to extract every last drop possible. And of course, if you didn't already know, olives were generally used for their oil more than for their food. They were much more valuable as fuel than they were as food. And that was their main commodification in the ancient world. And then the leftover dregs could be used for other purposes. But the oil itself was precious, and they would go to great lengths to get as much as they could from the olives that had been harvested. Let's finish off the verse with Rashi before we bounce over to Rashbam. So he continues to talk now about to cause the light to burn continually. Well, what does that mean? He must enkindle it so that the flame ascends by itself. Now, what is he focusing on? Well, thankfully, this translation draws your attention to the literalness of the word burn, with laha'alot, literally means to ascend, to go up. This is the same reason why we talk about an aliyah, when someone is going up onto the bima or is emigrating to the land of Israel. They are ascending, they are going up. And Rashi, based off the Talmud, is saying, yes, this is an operative word, not extraneous, that this is telling us that when you light the candles, it has to be lit in a way that the flame will rise up cleanly and distinctly. And anyone who's ever tried to mess around with wicks in puddles of oil to try and get an olive oil lit lamp going will know that it takes a little bit of skillful positioning to make sure that you get a good, clean flame that is going straight up. And that is what Rashi is telling us is needed. And then he's going to want to focus on the final word of our verse, verse 20, which is tamid, continually. Now, here we see the phrase regularly in our JPS translation. Rashi, this translation is doing continually, but as we're going to see, there's a reason why tamid is a little more slippery than you might have thought. Doing something every night, as described here, may be rendered tamid, continually, just as you speak of here in Numbers 27:6, the continual burnt offering, which is also called tamid, although this was sacrificed only from day to day. So too, in the case of the meal offering made in a flat pan, it is said, Leviticus 6:13, that it should be brought continually, tamid. And yet it was only brought thus, half of it in the morning and half of it in the evening. However, the expression tamid, which is used in connection with the showbread, the lechem panim, Exodus 25, denotes the whole period without a break from Shabbat to Shabbat. So what Rashi is trying to explain for us here is that the word tamid doesn't always mean always. That yes, it can often mean always, like with the lechem panim, the showbread, which had to always be there 24/7 for the entire period. But other uses of the word tamid in other contexts does not mean that it has to be on 24/7. And what he is talking about here is that the lighting of these candles is happening always at night, meaning that from evening to evening, you make sure that you are lighting this in the night. And other types of tamid can be a daily offering, meaning it happens every day, but not that it is taking place all day. And likewise, the additional meal offering was offered, as explicitly stated, half in the morning, half in the evening, and clearly not being brought in a continual, uninterrupted chain. So again, another solid warning against trying to interpret things literally, because usually that word literal is not going to help you. You need to unpack a word in context and with the insights gained from other parts of Torah. So as a side note, of course, in most congregations, you will find that this ner tamid, this regular lamp, this regular light, this always light, has become enshrined as part of our synagogue architecture to always have a light that is on in every sanctuary. Classically, this was done with oil lamps. Into the modern world, it is often done with electricity. Some people use gas. There are many different varieties, but it has continued to become, it has continued to be a fixture in our synagogues. One of the many ways that a Beit Knesset, a synagogue, has brought in some of the elements of the Mishkan as reminders for our own service, even though the Mishkan and temple as well have been gone for almost 2,000 years. Any questions on Rashi's commentaries here on verse 20? Okay. Just to point out that over here in Rashbam, there is first a commentary that is talking much more about the usage of the word Tetzaveh, about the commandments. And I don't want to get into it too much because grammar, I know, is not high on everybody's list. And then you can see as well in his discussion of Zach, of this clear olive oil, that he is agreeing with Rashi, that this means it has to be crushed more than ground in order to make sure that it is indeed clear oil. Now, Rashi continues to add commentary to chapter 27 and verse 21. Let's just line those up. Rashbam does not. So, reminder: this is the section where they're talking about the particular placement of the menorah and the care of it. And Rashi explains that this from evening to morning, which we talked about a little bit before in the last verse, give it its due measure of oil so that it may burn from evening to morning. Our rabbis estimated half a log of oil as sufficient for the nights of Tevet, I always get thrown off by the transliterations, which are long, and they ordained a similar quantity for every night of the year. And if any were left over on the shorter nights, it did not matter. So the idea here is that, yes, it needs to be lit so that it will burn from evening to morning, but you should be asking yourself, how do we make sure that it will last from evening till morning? Well, you need to put in a proper measure of oil. What is that proper measure? Well, you base it off the longest days of the year in the months of winter, Tevet being the time that has the the shortest days of the year and thus the longest night. And then you keep that same measure for all the other years. If it's good enough for the longest day, then it'll be good enough for the shortest day. If it's good enough for the longest night, it will be good enough for the shortest night. Now, why point out that if anything is left over, that doesn't matter? Well, you might have thought that there was some special need to treat the oil differently if it was a remainder at the end of the day, and it is being pointed out that it is not. You will note, however, that the original usage of this was that you would put in the oil in the evening and then it would burn through to the morning. You didn't need to have somebody standing by refilling it through the night, that you could be confident that once it was set burning in the evening with the proper measure, that it would burn till morning. And if something happened, well, something happened, but you had done what was necessary to fulfill the mitzvah in its form. All right, moving on to chapter 28, when we get into the fashion parade. Let's get our commentaries lined up. It's a little trickier trying to scroll 3 columns rather than just my usual one. All right. You shall bring forward your brother Aaron with his sons from among the Israelites to serve me as priests. Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, Eleazar, and Itamar, the sons of Aaron. So these are Aaron and his sons, and they are the ones that are being set up as the Kohanim that will serve as priests. The word Kohanim literally means priests. It is a generic term used for anyone that serves in a religious capacity to their gods, which is why it's used even for non-Jewish people. Obviously, in the modern world, the term Kohen has survived only in the Jewish context. So we think of it as being uniquely Jewish or Israelite, but it was a generic term for anyone serving in that capacity. Before we get into the clothing, which is taking up the bulk of this chapter, just one quick comment here from Rashi, that you will take this instruction to gather together the Aaron and his family, his sons. Well, that is after the work of the tabernacle is finished. Rashi is trying to clarify for us that their inauguration is not intended to happen immediately, but the inauguration of the Kohanim will happen once the Mishkan is completed. And indeed, that is entirely played out in the story, with the construction of the Mishkan finishing the book of Exodus and the beginning of Exodus, the beginning of Leviticus, giving us instructions not only on the sacrifices, but the precise way in which Aaron and his sons will be inaugurated as Kohanim. But like I said, the majority of this chapter is going to be about the clothing. Make sacral or sacral vestments for your brother Aaron for dignity and adornment. Next, you shall instruct all who are skillful, whom I have endowed with the gift of skill, to make Aaron's vestments for consecrating him to serve me as a priest. And just a little reminder, we often see this term vestment multiple times throughout the translation. That is a translator's flourish. The word is just begadim in all of its various forms, and begadim are just clothes. In English, we like to make a fine distinction between clothes worn for a holy purpose and clothes worn for mundane purposes, and we call the holy clothes vestments. Hebrew defines them by their use, but doesn't have a different term for them. So just every time you see the word vestment, just think clothes, and you'll be closer to the basic Hebrew. Obviously, these are going to be very special clothes, but I'm not entirely convinced we needed to use a special English word for them. These are the vestments they are to make: a breastpiece, an ephod, a robe, a fringed tunic, a headdress, and a sash. They shall make those sacral vestments for your brother Aaron and his sons for priestly service to me. They shall therefore receive the gold, the blue, purple, and crimson yarns, and fine linen. All right, before we get into the details of how each different element will be constructed, we are getting a general list of the things that they are going to have to wear. So as you can see, there is this thing called a breast piece, the choshen, which I've done classes about in the past. There is an ephod, which JPS helpfully translates as ephod. As we're going to see, there is a great deal of ambiguity of exactly what that is going to look like. There is the me'il, here translated as robe. There is the katonet, which is translated here as a fringed tunic. And then we have the tashbetz, which is the the katonet tashbetz is our fringed tunic, perhaps. And then we have our mitznefet, which is a headdress of some variety, and the avnet, the sash that goes around the midsection. So each of those is going to require a little bit of discussion. Here we're going to start with Rashbam, who gives sort of a blow-by-blow description, and then we're going to go back to Rashi, who tries to literally tie it all together. So these are the clothes, and yes, they are now listed individually. So we have our breastpiece, something resembling a sheath containing a pocket. Its precise nature depends on its use at the time. So Rashbam is being very pragmatic as usual, saying this choshen is clearly some sort of large pocket that is worn on the chest. We know that because of its placement later on. And it clearly has this pocket element to it. Again, we'll see that later on with the Urim and Tumim, the special stones that were kept inside of it. But it is also a somewhat ambiguous word, meaning that it can be of different shapes and styles. It doesn't have to be only as we're about to describe. The ephod, the ephod, a garment which is at one and at the same time decorative and protective, covering the chest of a person, worn as an outer garment. So we don't have a great word in English for this. The closest that comes for what Rashbam is describing here is an apron. That is to say, some sort of covering that goes primarily down the front, and which is worn on the outer layer above all the other clothes, which serves as here a decorative purpose as well as a protective purpose, something the English word apron doesn't quite convey. So yeah, this is probably best left untranslated, and think of this as being a relatively unique piece of clothing. And indeed, it does appear to be relatively unique in biblical context. And then he moves on to our the katonet tashbetz, this other knitted tunic. This garment being knitted had small holes all over it, as do most such knitted garments, which when made from wool. So he's using this phrase. What is tashbetz trying to tell us here? And he's saying it means that it was made, woven in a particular way that had a very loose weave to it, that it was not tight as though it were done on a loom. Perhaps in a modern language, we might say it was crocheted, meaning that it had a looser weave to it rather than a piece of cloth that had been pushed through a loom to create that tight warp and woof. And then the mitznefet, the headdress of some kind. This is a kind of hat worn on the head. We encounter the word describing royal headgear in Isaiah, where there it's usually translated as a royal diadem. So that definitely seems to be a fancy form of a head covering. And then let's just get the avnet back. Is a belt or sash of sorts. According to the plain meaning, this is the place where the trousers should have been mentioned, but they were not mentioned, as only garments of a distinctive character enhancing a person's stature are listed here. So we know later on that there are special linen trousers made for the Kohanim, and he is simply pointing out that those did not need to be added to this list, because we're not saying everything that he was wearing, because that would be unnecessary. We're only talking about the things that are made in a special way, or that were only worn by the Kohanim in order to enhance the stature and the symbolism of him within the community. So that's Rashbam's sort of categorical list of all of the different pieces here, and a simple way of trying to understand them. Now you'll notice he's not giving too much detail yet. Rashi is going to try and give a little bit more. And of course, as usual, his details are often have more emphasis on the symbolism behind what's going on, and not just the simple description. Come on, trying to get that in the right spot. So the Choshen, he goes back. This is a breastplate. It says breastplate, but really breastpiece is the right thing, because breastplate sounds too much like armor and a solid piece. And even though we do usually make a solid piece covering for the front of our Sifrei Torah, to where in this description, clearly it was not made from metal, it was a soft fabric construction. And this is an ornament born in front of the heart. And so he is telling us, first of all, that this is ornamental. So we shouldn't think of the Choshen as being a necessary piece of clothing just to be dressed, but it's got an ornamental purpose. And in front of the heart is rather critical, because as we'll find later on, probably not today with our discussion, but if you read through the rest of your Torah, the Choshen will represent all of the tribes, meaning the entirety of the people. And to have it on the heart is consistent with the constant admonitions that the Kohanim see themselves as serving the nation, as being a loving bridge for the nation and God, and having that connection to the heart is a very strong reminder. Of course, the word heart doesn't only mean love and emotion in biblical Hebrew, it also means thought and consideration, the intellect as well as the emotions. So don't limit it too much to just the warm fuzzies. And for the ephod, he has a much longer discussion, which just trying to see, I cannot get that on one screen. All right, I'll scroll as we go. So, and an ephod. I have heard no tradition, nor have I found in a Braita any description of its shape, but my own mind tells me that it was tied on behind him. All right, so he is trying to piece together what this would have actually looked like, and he is acknowledging that not in the Talmud, nor in any of the other Braitot, meaning the other rabbinic texts that were handed down either orally or written from 1,000 years before Rashi was alive, none of them seem to give a good physical description of exactly what this thing looked like. We have some clues. Indeed, as Rashbam pointed out, apron is probably a pretty good template, but exactly how that apron looked is something that Rashi is now going to try and apply his own rational facilities to uncover. Now, he's not claiming that he has pure and true knowledge of this. He's not saying that he had some vision which taught him what it looked like. He is trying to say, well, what could it look like? What should it look like, given how it was used and the few details we do know about its construction? So it tells him that it must have been tied behind him, that the ties for bringing it together must have been at the back, making the front a solid piece, again, much like a modern apron. Its breadth was the same as the breadth of a man's back, like a kind of apron, which is called, and I will not murder the French, in Old French, which ladies of rank tie on when they ride on horseback. I am not familiar with medieval French women's horse riding, but this is something that would have made a lot of sense, I'm sure, to Rashi's contemporaries. And you'll often find him using Old French words to try and provide some understanding of Old Hebrew words. Such, as mentioned, was the way in which the lower part was made, as it is said, and David was girded with a linen ephod. This informs us that the ephod was something tied on the body. That usual term of girding in biblical Hebrew always means to sort of tie, I'm trying to demonstrate, but my camera's too high, to sort of tie around you securely. It is, however, not possible to say that it consisted of a girdle only, because, as it says in Leviticus 8, and he put the ephod upon him, and after it is stated, and he girded him with the cheshev of the ephod. And this Onkelos translates by the girdle of the ephod. Therefore, this informs us that the cheshev is the girdle, and the ephod is the name of the ornamental garment itself. We're going to see more about that in verse 6 going forward. So he's pointing out that we do have some clues that although this was clearly tied in the way of tying a girdle on in biblical usage, that we shouldn't think of it as only covering from the waist down, but it must have also covered the top because it was put on, and then this choshev was used to secure it. So they are two different layers or two different aspects of the ephod, and the ephod must be more than just from the sash downwards. Further, it is not possible to assert that it was on account of the two shoulder straps that it was called ephod, that the term ephod applies to these two straps and the girdle to which they were attached, for it is said, the two shoulder pieces of the ephod, later on in verse 27. This tells us that the ephod is a separate name, the shoulder piece is a separate name, and the girdle a separate name. That is to say, each of these is the name of separate articles. So we shouldn't think of the ephod as just being the shoulder pieces attached to the sash. We need to think of the ephod as being its own distinctive garment. Consequently, I say that it is called ephod in reference to the apron-like garment which hung down, and that it was so called because they bedecked him, to play off that word, and ornamented him with it, as it is said in Leviticus, and he bedecked him with it. The choshev, the belty girdle thing, was the girdle which was on the upper portion of it, the ephod, and the shoulder pieces were attached to it. Further, my own mind tells me that there is evidence that it was a kind of garment, for Jonathan ben Uziel translates, this time taken from 2 Samuel 6, and David was girded with a linen ephod by a fine linen belt, which is exactly the similarity does he translate the melim, the robes, with the same word into the Aramaic in the story of Tamar, Absalom's sister. For with such robes were the king's daughters that were virgins apparelled. So Rashi is bending all of his rational faculties to try and untangle what this garment must have looked like. And he's looking for evidence of the way it's used, the way some of its words are translated, the way some of the words are echoed in other sections of Tanakh to try and make sense of this. Now, do we end up with a perfect representation of this particular structure that we would be able to get out the sewing machine and make an exact copy and be 100% sure that we know what it was? No. But do we have at least a working knowledge of what it might have looked like that does seem to match the basic structure of the verse, the words, and their usage in other places? And yes, I think Rashi does a pretty good job of bringing it together. It's not a slam dunk, and of course, there's room for discussion and disagreement, but Rashi does bring it together quite well. I do find it both fascinating that he is giving us such an extended glimpse into the rabbinic methodology of, if you find a word that you can't quite understand, look for other usages of that word or other things that seem similar to it in usage, and compare it and compare other translations, in this case the more famous Aramaic translations, to see whether or not you can piece together more from it. And use logic. If things seem to be described as separate, assume they are separate. If they appear to be connected, assume that they are connected. But that humility with the tenacious investigation is the hallmark of good rabbinic study. To know that you might be wrong, that you are trying to uncover something that is not clear, but not to give up, and to try and trace as many different possible leads to uncover what it looked like. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, why go through this much trouble? I mean, after all, Rashi, there's certainly more interesting things that need to be explained. There are bigger questions than just what was the shape of the garment that the Kohen wore. What about the questions of life and death, and of good and bad, of righteous and wicked behavior? Surely that should be getting our focus and our attention. Well, those obviously do get our focus and attention, but our focus is not so limited that we have to exclude these other discussions. Additionally, there is a general understanding in Jewish study that God gave us the Torah, the whole Torah, and that all the pieces of the Torah are important to us. yes, some may attract our attention much more easily. And we may say, wow, I'm really interested in this whole how do I treat my neighbor thing, because that seems very super relevant to me. And the whole what was the Kohen wearing doesn't seem terribly interesting to me. But first and foremost, if God chose to allow this to be in the Torah, then we should give it its due consideration and study. And secondly, as we go through and study, we may find insights that will surprise us, things that are of important understanding and wisdom that will help guide us. The whole discussion of the Choshen, the breastpiece being near the heart, and other aspects as well as found throughout these chapters are certainly of immediate spiritual relevance, even if we're not trying to reconstruct these particular items right now. Okay, let's go on though, because there is more that Rashi has to say about these items. I'm just going to sort of quickly run through them because it is very similar to what Rashbam says. So the me'il, the robe, this is a kind of shirt, and so too the ketonet, except that the ketonet was worn immediately on the body, and the me'il was a term for the outer shirt. So he's just trying to clarify the layers, and that ketonet, here the fringe tunic, would have been closer to the body, and the me'il would have been on the outer level, and then the ephod would have covered all of them. And then tashbetz is what type of ketonet is it? Well, it was quilted. And so he's simply pointing out that this idea that it was made was with the kind of indentations which are made in gold ornaments as a setting in which to fix precious stones and pearls. As it is said, the stones of the ephod enclosed in settings of gold. In French, they call them whatever you would pronounce that in Old French. So he's trying to give another description of the quilting, slightly different than Rashbam's, who really took it more as being like a loose crochet. Here he's saying, no, it's merely that it's wavy in the way that would have left these openings that would have been ideal for the setting of stones in them. The headdress, he argues, was kind of domed helmet, which they call in Old French, and then also in verse 40, it's called, which the Targum renders as being helmets in the Aramaic. And then the avnet, the belt or sash, this was a girdle upon the inner garment, and the ephod was the girdle over the outer garment, just as we find it stated in the description of the order in which they were donned, Leviticus 8, when we finally get the dressing scene. And he put upon him the inner garment, the ketonet, and girded him with the belt, the avnet, and clothed him with the mantle, the me'il, and put the ephod upon him. So from there we can see that this avnet was a inner sash that held the fringed tunic together, and then the me'il and the ephod went over the top of that. And as we also talked about, there was also this additional belty aspect of ornament on the ephod as well. But we'll get there. Well, hopefully we'll get there. Yes, we got time. And then he goes on to summarize these bigdei kodesh, these holy garments, garments of the holy thing. That is to say, from the heave offering that is sanctified to my name shall they make them. That this was made, built out of the donations that were brought in. That this is not something that was simply gone and bought off the rack. It wasn't something that was just commissioned. This is something that was made thanks to the donations of the community. And then, as we already saw, they collect additional yarns and fine linen, which Rashi tells us in his commentary on verse 5, and they shall take them, those men. Who's the taking? The men who are wise in heart, that we saw back in verse 3, who are to make the garments, and we shall receive them from the donors. And then he goes on to add the gold and the blue and the purple, that is to say, in order to make the garments of them. These are not being collected just to hold. These are being collected specifically because these garments are being made from these particular types of threads. All right. Verse 6, let's get everybody lined up, is going to take us into the ephod itself, meaning that now that we had the the general description of, or the general list of all the clothing. Now we're going to look at each piece in more detail. They shall make the ephod of gold, of blue, purple, and crimson yarn, and of fine twisted linens worked into designs. It shall have 2 shoulder pieces attached. They shall be attached at its 2 ends. And the decorated band that is upon it shall be made like it, of 1 piece with it, of gold, of blue, purple, and crimson yarns, and of fine twisted linen. Okay, before we get to the stones that are going to go onto it, let's look at our commentary for verse 6. So Rashbam is going to help us here a little bit. Although my grandfather Rashi has explained both the ephod and the choshen, the breastpiece, in detail, I plan to concentrate on some aspects, which he has not mentioned in his commentary. It is always nice that he is respectful, that if he doesn't have anything to add, if he doesn't have anything other than a duplication of what his grandfather had already written, that he will refrain. But both he and his grandfather have a lot to say about the ephod. But just checking my time here, I want to go ahead and move past that. They are still going through the work of trying to unravel exactly what the ephod looked like, how it was put together. But we've already spent a fair bit of time on that. And again, I don't want to overburden you with some of the details. Sorry, just letting it scroll through so those that are watching this in the home video can pause and read the additional commentary. As you can see, both of them have quite a lot to say about this construction. And it is fascinating to look through. Just a second till I get to 28.8. Let's get our Torah up there. Just a little bit of an insight here before we leave 28.7 for Rashi talking about the gold, blue, purple, red, crimson, twisted. The 5 materials were intertwined in every strand. They beat out the gold into the form of thin plates, and from them they cut threads. They wove that gold thread together with the 6 threads of blue purple and a gold thread with 6 threads of red purple, and similarly with the crimson and similarly with the fine linen. Because all the materials had their threads 6-fold, and there was a gold thread with each of them. Then they intertwined them all into 1 thread. It followed, therefore, that their thread was 28-fold. This to work the threads of gold in the blue, purple, and in the red, purple, etc., which tells us that the gold thread was intertwined with each material. So if you ever wondered, how did they actually get gold woven? Well, they did it the way many ancient people did, which was hammering the gold until it was paper thin or even thinner, and then cutting the paper thin into strips, very, very thin wires in a modern sense. And they didn't have the wire drawing technique down quite as commonly as we now do. And then that would be woven into the threads itself in order to make sure that there really was a gold thread that intertwined with all of this. And then the work of an artist that had a design. He's focusing here at the end of verse 7, that, the end of verse 6, that it has this worked into designs, the Maseh Choshev. As he explained already back in 26, we didn't look at that together, but it's there. This was weaving on both sides. That is, the designs on both sides were not similar to one another. It wasn't merely that it was embroidered on the front and blank on the back, or only the back of the threads, but instead there was a design that was on the front and a different design that was on the back, so that both were done completely, as Rashi explains again in that other section. And then when we are here in verse 8, and then Rashbam points out that this decorative belt piece, the sash that was built into the ephod, that the belt attached to the sash acted as a connecting link, tying things together, as described in Leviticus 8:7, which we already quoted. So the image that you should have in your mind is of having a decorative band going around the middle of this ephod-like apron, and that it was the attachment point to connect the shoulder piece attachments, the back, everything together. That this was the harness, I guess you could say, for everything being brought together and secure. Now, in 28, wrong column. In 28:7, we talked about those shoulder pieces, and then Rashi wants to give us a little bit more of an explanation on those as well. The apron was below, and the choshev, the belt of the ephod, was the belt, and this was joined to it on its top edge, similar to the apron of ladies who ride on horseback, Rashi's go-to explanation. On the priest's back, there were joined to the belt two pieces like two wide straps, one opposite each shoulder. So going down the back, there would have been these very, very long. So rather than a modern apron, which often will tie around the neck, this apron would have met at the top and gone back down in two strips down the back, according to Rashi's interpretation. He lifted these up upon his two shoulders so that they hung down in front of him before his breast. And because they were joined to the rings in the breastplate, they were held fast in front of him upon his heart, so that they could not fall off his shoulders backwards, just as is explained in verse 28. They thus lay on his back in erect position, and they passed over his shoulders, and the two onyx stones were fixed upon them, one stone upon each shoulder piece. We haven't talked about those stones yet, so don't worry that you missed that. And then the two ends of it on the width of the ephod, that is to say, at the extremity of the width, for its width was equal only to that of the priest's back, and did not go entirely around his body, meaning it was only up to the width of the shoulders, but it didn't cover the sides of the Kohen. So that one may well speak of the two extremities of the ephod. If it went all the way around, then there's no end. And its height was up to the elbows, which they call whatever in Old French, and not higher, because it is said, they shall not gird themselves, meaning in Ezekiel 44, they shall not gird themselves in the place where one perspires, meaning your armpits, namely not higher than their elbows and not lower than their loins, but only by their elbows. So from the height of the elbow against the body down to the beginning of the V in the legs, that was where the body was enveloped by the main part of this ephod apron. And it, meaning the ephod, shall be joined with the two shoulder pieces of the ephod. He shall join them below the belt with a needle, and he shall not weave them together with it, but he must weave them separately and join them afterwards. Even though they are made to be attached to one another, they are not made to be of one piece. They are a separate piece, as we've talked about, and they can be sewn to connect, but not sewn into the other object, not woven into as though it were one piece. And then going on to verse 8, yep, I did already, just making sure this is the one we finished with. So this decorated band signifies, and the girdle by means of which he bedecks it, meaning the ephod, and puts it on an order for the priest and adorns him. So we are being reminded that this band has a decorative purpose. It is not a necessarily a utilitarian piece only. And of course, we see here again the afudato, that it will be a decorated band, or it will be a band to decorate him. And as discussed, that this afudato, the root of that word is probably, in Rashi's mind at least, the origin of the word ephod as a whole, as a decorative form, and which was put upon it, we already discussed, above the edge of the apron. This is therefore the girdle. And according to the work thereof, As the weaving of the apron, the work of the artist and of the 5 materials, so the weaving of the belt also was the work of an artist and of 5 materials. These were made in the same style. So the way that the cloth was being produced and the way that it was being put together would have been of a consistent fabric, a consistent construction. And it shall be of the same, that is to say, it shall be woven together with it, and one shall not weave it separately and join it afterwards. Unlike the shoulder bands, this choshev, this decorated band, is going to be actually built into the ephod, even though it serves this decorative and distinctive purpose. It is made of one piece with it, as we can see. And thus it is different than the shoulder pieces. The shoulder pieces are woven and then sewn on it. This is woven into, even though it will also be distinctive. All right, let's just get a little bit in our last few minutes here about these shoulder stones. Then take 2 lazuli stones and engrave on them the names of the sons of Israel, 6 of their names on one stone, and the names of the remaining 6 on the other stone, in the order of the birth. And the 2 stones you shall make seal engravings, the work of lapidary, of the names of the sons of Israel, having bordered them with frames of gold. Attach the 2 stones to the shoulder pieces of the ephod as stones for remembrance of the Israelite people, whose names Aaron shall carry upon his 2 shoulder pieces for remembrance before the Lord. So we're getting 2 stones, one that's going to be on each shoulder, and each will have names of the tribes. And that is going to be something that is symbolically critical for Aaron to be wearing and carrying into his work as Kohen, that he is literally bearing the nation upon his shoulders. Now, before we go, let's just get back here to verse 10 and see Rashi's interpretation of this. So we had this idea that we have 6 on one side, 6 on the others, and that this is done in the order of their birth. What does that mean? Well, in the order in which they were born. That is to say, Reuben, Shimeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali go on one shoulder, and on the other shoulder, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin, the last name being written full. That is to say, with a yud before the last letter. There are different spelling conventions of many different names and words in general, for that matter, in Hebrew, some of which will have additional letters signifying the vowels. Here, the extra yud in the name Benjamin, Benjamin, and sometimes it can be written with that extra letter, sometimes written without. And the argument here is that it will be written with the extra letter. Why? For that is how it is written in the passage that tells of his birth. Even though it can come in both varieties, since we're talking about their birth, then we should use the spelling that reflects his name at birth. And of course, this also means that this gives 25 letters on each stone, so that we end up with 25 letters and 6 names on one side, and 25 letters for 6 names on the other side, which is a remarkable coincidence of the equality of the tribes, even though the tribes certainly were not equal in number, and they were not equal in stature. They were not equal in what they have accomplished and their successes, and all the other ways that there are inequalities throughout people. The tribes represented all of that type of inequality. Nonetheless, when Aaron is bearing them, they are equal. There is not the good side and the bad side, the important side and the less important side. It's across the board. These are all the people. These are the Israelites, and that is something that I think is a incredibly important insight, and one that sometimes these little quirks of spelling and numbers can draw our attention to. Oftentimes, when God simply says 6 on one, 6 on the other, we blow by it as though, oh, well, sure, you're just dividing it in half, and we fail to realize the depth to which God is trying to teach us about the equality of all. Sometimes when these little coincidental numbers or spelling issues come up, it can get people's attention a little bit more clearly. One of the great things we have to thank our commentators for drawing our attention to things that we may not have stopped to figure out for ourselves. I know before I ever came across this commentary, I never sat down to spell out the names to see if there was anything interesting in addition to there being 6 on one and 6 on the other. And yet, obviously, sages much greater than I have done so, and we all benefit from their insights. All right, I don't want to go any further because, well, there's so much more to say, and I don't think we'll have time to really go on. But I am very glad that the internet has continued to work all throughout our study today. I'm still changing, but just have to wait for the technicians to get all the right things in order for that to make it, for that to work. So I wish everybody a good day. Have a wonderful rest of your study of Tetzaveh, and I will see you all next week.